Welcome, everyone. Aloha. My name is Patrice Flowers, and I'm the director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We're excited to welcome you to a talk on climate security theory is incomplete without a gendered human security lens. This event is being hosted by the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs. We're thrilled to have Ms. Maryruth Belsey Priebe here with us today to discuss the climate crisis through a gendered human security perspective. The climate crisis is one of the greatest threats to humankind and is contributing to the occurrence of more frequent, intense, and severe weather events, natural disasters, and humanitarian crises globally. Meanwhile, the Indo-Pacific region is one of the global epicenters of climate-related insecurity, as it is home to some of the most vulnerable and disaster-prone countries in the world, posing major challenges to human rights, development, environmental stability, and sustainable economies. Addressing these themes with us today is Ms. Belsey Priebe. She's the co-founder of aXXelerate, a firm that works to bring gender perspectives into every security conversation. She has served as a consultant with the U.S. Department of Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces, and she also serves as the Gender Interest Group of the Environmental Peace Building Association co-chair. She holds a Harvard International Relations graduate degree. Ms. Belsey Priebe will present for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A discussion moderated by myself. We're looking forward to a great discussion. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to Ms. Belsey Priebe for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flowers, and good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps it's also good morning and good evening, depending on where people are joining from. It's really nice to be here today, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to share my research on the gender climate security nexus with the SIPA community. Today, I'm going to explore the intersection of gender and climate security in the Indo-Pacific region, and in particular, how gender considerations permeate every level of climate security challenges and responses. As future security practitioners, hopefully many of you are, understanding these intersections will be crucial for your work in the region. This presentation, throughout this presentation, I'm going to cover how climate change is a threat multiplier impacting peace and security, especially for women. I'm going to explore the intersection of the women, peace, and security agenda in the context of climate change, and specifically, we're going to highlight 5 key areas where gender, climate, and security intersect in important ways. This overview sets the stage for the rest of the presentation, where I'll dive into each of those 5 key intersections. The goal is to provide a holistic understanding of how climate change is exacerbating existing security challenges, and how it's impossible to fully understand these challenges without a gender lens. Before diving into the gender aspects, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what climate security is. Climate change creates multiple security challenges through resource scarcity, extreme weather events, population displacement, and economic disruption. These environmental challenges have direct security implications, leading to states' fragility, civil unrest, regional tensions, and humanitarian crises. In the Indo-Pacific region, these challenges are particularly acute due to geographical vulnerabilities and population density. The Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, I'm not sure if you're all aware of what it is, but it was established by the UN Security Council Resolution number 1325 in 2000, so almost 25 years ago. And it provides a crucial framework for understanding gender in security contexts. The WPS agenda has 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery. And it offers a structured approach to incorporating gender perspectives in security operations. This framework remains relevant as we face new security challenges like climate change, and it has changed and adapted over the years in order to address these new challenges. In the following sections, I'm going to explore how a human security lens reveals the centrality of gender across 5 intersections of the climate security nexus. First, we'll examine how climate change undermines human security by amplifying gendered insecurities. We'll also look at the gender differences in maladaptive responses to climate security challenges. Next, we'll trace the human security implications of climate stress triggering gendered patterns of crime and violence. Shifting to response frameworks, I'll also explore both the challenges and opportunities of integrating gender in military approaches to protecting human security in climate-affected contexts, highlighting promising practices that enhance effectiveness as well as persistent institutional barriers. Building on these insights, we'll investigate how gendered leadership patterns shape the ability to safeguard human security in climate crises, with a focus on how the strengths of women's and men's leadership can be harnessed for comprehensive resilience. Finally, we'll underscore the connectedness of human and national security and briefly explore the transformative potential of mainstreaming gender in climate resilient development and peace building as a cornerstone of inclusive human security in a warming world. With this human security lens in mind, let's begin our deep dive into the gendered realities of climate security. So let's start first by looking at the stark realities of how gender shapes physical vulnerability to climate disasters. The often cited statistic that women are 4 times more likely to die in climate disasters only hints at the complex interplay of cultural norms and physical restrictions that create this disparity. For instance, in Bangladesh's 1991 cyclone, 90% of the 140,000 fatalities were women. Why? First, early warning information typically reached men in public spaces but didn't penetrate to women in households. Second, women waited for male family members to return and make evacuation decisions, as is often customary. And third, many women had never learned to swim, a direct result of cultural modesty norms. In many Indo-Pacific communities, women's traditional clothing can impede quick movement during emergencies as well. Cultural restrictions on women's mobility mean they often can't evacuate without male accompaniment. And when they reach emergency shelters, many women face new risks due to lack of privacy, inadequate lighting, and unsafe sanitation facilities. These are not just inconveniences, but rather they can be life and death situations during climate emergencies, especially for women. We also must consider how resource access and control patterns fundamentally shape climate vulnerability. Research highlights how women's limited land ownership creates a cascade of adaptation barriers. For instance, in most Asian countries, less than 20% of landowners are women, yet they comprise the majority of agricultural workers. This means when climate adaptation resources are distributed based on land ownership, which is common, women are systemically excluded. Let me give you another concrete example. When climate insurance schemes are introduced, they typically require land titles as collateral. Women without formal property rights can't access these tools, even if they're the primary farmers. And then after disasters, this pattern intensifies because women often lack the documentation to prove property claims, leading to disproportionate asset losses. The technology gap compounds these issues. In South Asia, women are 28% less likely to own a mobile phone and 56% less likely to use mobile internet than men. This digital divide means they can't access early warnings, mobile banking, which is often used to send emergency aid, or climate information services. For instance, during the 2015 Nepal earthquake, many women couldn't access relief funds because they lacked the required digital identification or mobile money accounts. So let's look at health. Climate change creates unique health challenges that intersect with gender in complex ways. For instance, pregnant women may face elevated risks during extreme heat events, and studies show that there's often an increase, sometimes of 16% or more, of pregnancy complications during heat waves. But it's not just about the direct physical impacts. Mental health patterns also show fascinating gender differences. Women typically report higher rates of post-disaster anxiety and depression, but this often relates to their caregiver roles. When children are traumatized by disasters, women absorb significant secondary trauma while trying to support their recovery. Men, conversely, often experience mental health impacts related to lost livelihoods, but are less likely to seek help due to stigma. The healthcare access gap becomes particularly evident in disaster aftermaths. In the Philippines, for example, Women's reproductive health needs were often overlooked in disaster response. Basic supplies for menstrual hygiene became luxury items, and pregnant women in evacuation centers lacked prenatal care. These gaps create long-term health consequences that extend far beyond the immediate disaster period. So before I conclude this section on gendered insecurities and how they're intensified as a result of climate change, let's examine what is often overlooked, and that is the vulnerabilities that men face in climate disasters. While much research focuses on women's challenges, and rightly so because of the stark statistics, there are important patterns in how gender norms create distinct risks for men. So first, if you look at occupational hazards, gender norms that cast men as protectors often place them at high risk in high-risk situations during climate disasters. Men, for instance, make up the majority of casualties in rescue operations and emergency response. And during Australia's catastrophic bushfires, for instance, men faced increased mortality risks, both as firefighters and through cultural expectations for them to stay and defend property. These aren't just individual choices, they're deeply embedded in masculinity norms. The mental health impacts on men, as I mentioned, are also concerning. Climate-related livelihood disruption creates profound identity crises for men in traditional provider roles. When fishing grounds collapse or agricultural land becomes unproductive, men often face what researchers call masculine role strain, and that's a term I'll return to several times. Yet gender norms that equate seeking help with weakness create barriers to accessing mental health support. In Pacific Island communities, studies show men are 3 times less likely than women to seek psychological support after climate disasters, despite experiencing significant trauma. The socioeconomic pressures on men often manifest in forced migration in response to climate change, undermining traditional livelihoods. This creates new vulnerabilities. Men often end up in hazardous work environments in urban settings, face exploitation in informal economies, and suffer from family separation. In Bangladesh's climate-stressed coastal regions, for example, male migration has led to what some researchers call missing men communities, where both those who leave and those left behind faced increased vulnerabilities. Understanding these male-specific vulnerabilities is crucial for several reasons. First, it helps us move beyond simplistic victim and protector narratives. Second, it reveals how gender norms can harm both women and men in climate crises. And finally, it suggests that transforming rigid gender roles could reduce vulnerability for all genders. Shifting gears, let's consider how gender dynamics shape maladaptive responses to climate stress. So this is a different category of the gender, climate, and security intersections. Economic maladaptation, it's a very difficult word, maladaptation represents some of the most concerning responses, often reinforcing gender inequalities in ways that create long-term vulnerabilities. A particularly troubling trend is the use of early marriage as an economic coping strategy in climate-stressed communities. In Bangladesh's drought-prone regions, for instance, research shows a 20% increase in early marriage rates during extended dry periods. This isn't simply about tradition, it's an economic calculation. Families facing climate-related crop failures see daughters' marriages as both a way to reduce household costs and secure resources through dowry. The tragic irony is that these marriages often make both the girls and their future children more vulnerable to climate impacts due to reduced education, earlier pregnancies, and limited decision-making power. As I mentioned, male migration patterns represent another form of economic maladaptation, which creates a double vulnerability. Men face exploitation in urban settings while their families lose labor capacity at home. In Kiribati, for example, male migration has left many coastal communities with reduced capacity to maintain traditional sea walls, increasing their vulnerability to rising seas. There are 2 other types of maladaptive behaviors that are very common. The first is that girl children are often removed from school as a way to reduce costs for the household and to gain free labor in the home. And often women-headed households choose to sell assets to buy food, for instance, thereby reducing their future income earning capacity. Another critical form of maladaptation is the increase in social reproduction responsibilities. Social reproduction is what many refer to as unpaid care domestic work. And this is the work related to maintaining families and communities. It's the work that women are often responsible to do. Through a concept known as depletion through social reproduction, climate change intensifies women's unpaid care burdens to unsustainable levels. For example, in drought-affected areas in Southeast Asia, women report spending an additional 4 to 5 hours daily collecting water while they maintain all the other regular care activities that they're responsible for. This creates, a time poverty trap. Women have no time for rest, skill development, or participation in adaptation planning. The resulting physical exhaustion and mental stress lead to maladaptive coping strategies like skipping meals or postponing healthcare. What's particularly concerning is how this depletion becomes normalized, as women's labor is often seen as a free mechanism of adjustment during hard times. There are documented cases where women's health deterioration is seen as an acceptable trade-off for family survival during climate stress. This normalization makes the long-term consequences for community resilience when primary caregivers are systemically depleted. Psychological maladaptation, as I've mentioned, also shows fascinating gender differences. Men often respond to climate-related livelihood stress, like I said, through masculine role strain. When traditional provider roles become impossible to fulfill, many men adopt destructive coping mechanisms. In fishing communities affected by climate-related fish stock collapse, research documents increased rates of alcohol abuse among men, often accompanied by domestic tensions and violence as well. Yet gender norms that discourage male emotional expression mean many men avoid seeking help until crisis points. Women, conversely, often internalize stress through self-sacrifice behaviors, like taking on additional burdens through minimizing their own needs. These individual psychological maladaptations create community-level impacts. When men withdraw from community leadership roles due to perceived failure, or when women become too depleted to maintain social networks, the community's collective adaptation capacity declines. Okay, so moving on from maladaptation, we want to talk about another critical intersection, which is how climate stress influences crime, violence, and group tensions across gender lines. While overall crime rates often increase in climate-stressed areas, the types of crimes show distinct gender patterns. Evidence indicates women are more likely to engage in survival-based property crimes, particularly food theft, while men more commonly participate in organized resource theft or join criminal networks. For example, in areas experiencing severe drought, women's arrests for food-related theft increased by 15%, but these crimes were typically small-scale and survival-driven. Conversely, men's involvement in organized water theft and illegal resource extraction increased by 40%, often connected to broader criminal networks. Women's crime participation typically stems from immediate survival needs, especially when they're responsible for feeding their families. Men's involvement more often relates to status loss and network influences, particularly when climate change disrupts traditional livelihoods. In fishing communities affected by stock collapse, for instance, existing criminal networks exploit unemployed fishermen's knowledge for illegal fishing operations. The pathway from climate stress to violence is complex, but research identifies clear gender patterns in this escalation. One significant finding is how violence often erupts through a cascade of pressures rather than direct climate impacts. For instance, domestic violence rates typically increase 30 to 60% following major climate events. Specific trigger points have been identified, for instance, when men lose primary income sources, when household resources become severely constrained, and when traditional gender roles become impossible to maintain. A powerful example involves coastal communities facing sea level rise. As traditional male roles in fishing become untenable, increased rates of both domestic violence and community level conflicts were found. The violence often manifests along gender lines. Men experiencing masculine role strain may resort to violence to assert control, while women facing increased vulnerability may experience higher rates of community-level harassment and assault. Distinct motivational pathways have been identified that influence whether individuals join organized violence or crime groups. For men, three primary drivers, and this is one of the most important factors when thinking about the gender climate security nexus. Three primary drivers have been documented. Identity-based motivations, especially when climate change threatens traditional masculine roles. Economic pressures, particularly in resource-strained regions. And social network influences, especially in areas where there's existing conflict. Research in the Philippines, for example, shows how climate-stressed fishing communities became recruitment grounds for militant groups when men's lost livelihoods created vulnerability to extremist narratives. Women's pathways to conflict participation show different patterns. Women are more likely to engage in political violence when climate impacts threaten family survival, such as through the loss of water or food. And in some cases, women's participation in climate-related civil unrest can escalate to broader political violence, especially when state responses are repressive. Criminal networks' exploitation of climate vulnerability represents one of the most concerning trends. Trafficking networks specifically target climate-stressed communities using gender-specific strategies. Women and girls face increased risk of sex trafficking and forced marriage, particularly in communities where climate change has eroded traditional protection systems. Men and boys are more often targeted for labor trafficking, especially in regions where climate change has destroyed traditional livelihoods. In the Indo-Pacific region, climate displacement creates new trafficking corridors, with criminal networks exploiting both source communities' vulnerabilities and destination communities' labor demands. Turning our attention to responses, research provides critical insights into how military and security institutions are adapting their frameworks to address gender dimensions of climate security. This isn't just about adding women to existing structures, it's about fundamentally rethinking operational approaches. The research reveals fascinating contrasts in how different security forces approach gender integration in climate response. For example, analysis of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or HADR operations, shows that teams with gender balanced composition typically achieve better outcomes in community engagement and aid distribution. There are specific cases where female military personnel were crucial in reaching vulnerable populations, particularly in culturally conservative areas where male-female interaction is restricted. However, significant institutional barriers have also been identified. Many military organizations still treat gender considerations as an add-on rather than a core operational requirement. Research documents how this can lead to serious gaps in effectiveness. For instance, when evacuation procedures don't account for women's mobility constraints, or when relief distribution methods inadvertently exclude female-headed households. Digging deeper into military response frameworks, research has documented how male and female security personnel bring different but complementary knowledge to climate response operations. This isn't about inherent capabilities of men and women. It's about gendered experiences and how they shape operational insights. A compelling example is when female security personnel often have better understanding of household level vulnerabilities and social networks critical to effective evacuation planning. Male personnel may have better insight into local power structures and potentially security threats. Research shows how combining these perspectives leads to more comprehensive risk assessments and response planning. A particularly interesting finding involves trust-building approaches. In post-disaster contexts, research indicates that mixed gender security teams are more effective at building community trust. Cases were documented where female security personnel were able to gather crucial information about community needs that wouldn't have been shared with an all-male team, while male personnel were better positioned to engage with traditional leadership structures. Another critical dimension of military response is civil military cooperation, or CivMil cooperation. Research reveals a critical gap in how security forces interface with civilian gender expertise. While many militaries have adopted formal policies on gender integration, practical coordination with women's organizations and gender experts often remains ad hoc. This leads to missed opportunities. For instance, when local women's networks knowledge of vulnerable community members isn't incorporated into evacuation planning. The institutional transformation needed to fully integrate gender considerations into climate security operations is substantial. Research identifies specific challenges at policy, training, and resource levels. One significant trend is resistance to change within security institutions. Research documents how traditional military cultures can impede gender integration, even when formal policies support it. However, research shows that when senior leadership actively champion gender integration and link it to operational effectiveness, resistance tends to decrease. So finally, shifting focus to leadership. Research highlights the diverse styles that emerge in climate security contexts, each with distinct strengths and weaknesses. Three broad categories have been identified. Network-based approaches that prioritize community engagement and local knowledge, traditional hierarchies that leverage formal authority structures, and hybrid models that attempt to bridge these two. Importantly, these leadership styles are not gender neutral. Women leaders often gravitate toward network-based approaches, drawing on their deep community-level insights and social capital. Men, conversely, are more likely to operate within traditional hierarchies, leveraging institutional expertise and formal decision-making processes. However, these are just tendencies, not binaries. Case studies showcase innovative leadership of all genders who skillfully navigate across leadership styles, demonstrating critical cross-cultural competencies. In the climate security realm, the most effective leaders are often those who can adapt their approach to the specific context and stakeholders at hand. Gendered leadership strengths come to the fore in high-pressure climate crises contexts, such as HADR responses. Women's leadership often excels at rapid social network mobilization. In the aftermath of disasters, women leaders are frequently quicker to activate community support systems and organize grassroots relief efforts. Men's leadership, meanwhile, tends to be more effective in leveraging formal institutions and coordinating large-scale response systems. Critically, these are complementary capabilities, not competing ones. The most resilient communities are those that can harness both the nimble adaptability of social networks and robust capabilities of formal institutions. Gendered patterns in crisis planning approaches have also been identified. Women leaders often prioritize long-term resilience, focusing on issues like social cohesion and psychosocial support that are key to sustainable recovery. Men leaders, conversely, often focus more on immediate response systems and physical infrastructure. Integrating these perspectives is crucial for developing holistic crisis management strategies. Zooming out to the regional level, we see that gender differentiated vulnerabilities at the individual level can cascade into broader community destabilization and ultimately regional insecurity. Understanding these pathways is crucial for effective security planning. Case studies vividly illustrate these cascade effects. In Bangladesh, for instance, research traces how women's exclusion from household decision-making exacerbates their vulnerability to climate-induced food insecurity. As women's health and productivity deteriorates, family stability erodes, contributing to the broader community fragmentation. Left unchecked, these local stresses can fuel wider social unrest and even violent conflict. Gender norms and expectations play a key role in amplifying these cascade effects. As climate pressures mount, rigid gender norms often strain to the breaking point. Men facing sudden loss of livelihoods or traditional identity markers may be more susceptible to recruitment into extremist groups, as I mentioned. Women excluded from adaptation decision-making may resort to high-risk coping strategies that undermine long-term resilience. Tracing the pathways from local stresses to national security threats is important for understanding how climate pressures intersect with gender-specific vulnerability points to fuel wider instability. At the household level, gender divisions of labor and resource control shape differential exposures to climate risk. When these household level stresses overwhelm traditional coping mechanisms, they can quickly escalate into community-wide tension points. Here again, research illustrates the critical role of gender in shaping these escalation pathways. In agrarian communities facing increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, for example, competition over land and water resources often takes on gender dimensions as women's and men's livelihoods roles come under pressure. Similarly, in urban areas contending with climate-induced migration, the intersection of shifting gender roles and intensifying resource scarcity can be a potent driver of social conflict. As these local tensions metastasize, they can feed into broader conflict dynamics at the national level. This research helps map these critical junctures where targeted gender response interventions could help disrupt negative feedback loops and foster more resilient communities. Extending this analysis to the transnational level, research illuminates how gender considerations shape the cross-border dimensions of climate security in powerful ways. Migration is perhaps the most visible cross-border impact of climate change. As environmental pressures intensify, gendered patterns of mobility are increasingly salient. In some contexts, a masculization of migration has been documented as men facing diminished rural livelihoods seek work in urban centers or across borders. In others, the growing prevalence of women-led migration as a household adaptation strategy has been highlighted. These shifting migration patterns can have complex ripple effects on both origin and destination communities, altering local gender dynamics in ways that can contribute to social tensions. Resource competition, too, takes on critical gender and regional dimensions in the context of shared watersheds, fishing grounds, and other transboundary resources. Case studies highlight how women's systemic exclusion from natural resource governance regimes can exacerbate regional tensions over increasingly scarce resources. At the same time, a gender lens can also highlight opportunities for regional cooperation on climate security challenges. Inclusive peace processes that prioritize women's meaningful participation, for example, have been shown to enhance the sustainability of transboundary resource agreements. Similarly, regional women's networks have played key roles in cross-border conflict prevention efforts around climate-sensitive flashpoints. So, let's just recap these 5 intersections of gender and climate security. Amplified gendered insecurities, from physical vulnerabilities and disaster to resource access barriers, climate change exacerbates existing gender inequalities. Both women and men face distinct risks shaped by gendered norms and expectations. Gender in maladaptive responses refers to economic coping strategies like early marriage, male outmigration, and depletion through social reproduction. These often reinforce gender inequities. Psychological maladaptation also shows gendered patterns, with breaking points signaling risks of systemic failure. Gendered climate-related crime and violence is the third one. Climate stress influences crime and violence along gender lines. Women's survival crime contrasts with men's involvement in organized resource theft. Cascading pressures trigger gendered violence, from increased domestic abuse to recruitment into armed groups. Then we looked at military response frameworks. Integrating gender and military climate response requires rethinking operational approaches. From mixed gender teams to civ-mil cooperation, gender responsive strategies enhance effectiveness. Transforming metrics and institutional culture is key. And finally, we looked at gender-based leadership approaches. Climate crises reveal gendered leadership strengths, from women's network mobilization to men's formal coordination. Integrating diverse styles and planning priorities is crucial for holistic crisis management and long-term resilience. So hopefully you can see how this research leaves us with several important takeaways that should guide future efforts to address climate security in the Indo-Pacific. First and foremost, gender considerations are not peripheral to climate security. They are absolutely central. From the individual to the international level, gendered power structures, roles, and knowledge shape vulnerability and resilience in profound ways. Integrating gender analysis across all levels of climate security planning is not optional, it is imperative. Second, achieving this integration will require a concerted effort on multiple fronts. We need policy frameworks that mandate attention to gender in climate security assessments and action plans. We need institutional reforms within governments, security forces, and civil society organizations to dismantle barriers to women's leadership and establish accountability for gender responsiveness. And perhaps most importantly, we need a fundamental shift toward more inclusive, participatory approaches to climate adaptation that value the knowledge and agency of people of all genders. Finally, while the challenges are daunting, this research also highlights the immense opportunities inherent in this transformative work. Around the Indo-Pacific region, women are leading some of the most innovative efforts to build climate resilience, from community-based early warning systems to transnational advocacy campaigns. By supporting and scaling these efforts and by systemically bringing gender considerations into the heart of climate security planning, we have the potential to not only mitigate the security risks of a warming world, but to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future for all. Of course, realizing this potential will require ongoing commitment, collaboration, and courage. But if this research has shown anything, it is that inclusive, gender-responsive leadership in the face of climate change is not only necessary, it is possible. By embracing this leadership challenge in all its complexity, the Indo-Pacific region can pioneer a new paradigm of climate security that places gender justice at its core. And that concludes my talk, and I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Maryruth. I wanted to say that was a really interesting talk. I mean, I sometimes thinking about these issues seems quite overwhelming, and so you've given us a lot to think about, and I want to just dig in a little bit with some questions. So first, I'm wondering, you started at the gendered, sort of human security level, zoomed out thinking about the national, and then thinking about regional or transnational. How can governments and international organizations actually integrate a gendered human security lens into their existing climate security policies, especially in the Indo-Pacific?
A great question. I would say one of the biggest opportunities for virtually every country in the world is to look at adopting policies that are actually getting at the triple nexus at the same time. Right now, we have a lot of siloing. So there's climate change adaptation that's separate from gender equality initiatives that are separate from security initiatives, and there's not a lot of integration of the two. It is complex, and so I understand why, but I would say that would be the first thing. Women, in consulting with women in a meaningful way is, of course, the cornerstone of the WPS agenda. And it is still something that is very fundamentally lacking, especially in the Indo-Pacific, where gender norms still limit women's leadership in many ways. So having women in leadership, both at the planning level and implementation levels, policymaking levels, and then also at in the emergency response systems as well, is extremely important. I would say I think the other area to look at would be, well, and this is sort of going at what I was saying before, but having more civil cooperation, more coordination between different branches of government, and cross-pollination of ideas. And then, of course, the bells that we always ring within the WPS world is the need for significant funding and resourcing of all of these programming solutions. So, yeah.
Oh, along with that, I'm wondering, do you have any examples of either responses that have worked well? I mean, maybe not all three come together at the same time, but responses that have worked well, or plans that, a particular country or particular community might have that really, tries to integrate some of this. Maybe they haven't actually had to put these plans into action, but they're at the planning stage, they're already doing this. Are you aware of any of those?
Yeah. Vanuatu is actually a really good example.
Hmm.
They have this extremely robust group of women's organizations.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are something like 600 different organizations as part of the network. And in their most recent typhoon or cyclone disasters, the women's groups have been absolutely instrumental in the distribution of aid. And
Mm-hmm.
so they have a really good relationship with their governments and the military as well. And so they're already in communication ahead of a disaster,
Mm-hmm.
and are they know the systems, they have processes, and they are situated within their communities so that they can be really good resource hubs for people who need help following a disaster. So that's a really good example of civil cooperation, of women in leadership, and a really good, better than average resourcing, I would say.
Uh-huh.
Um, that's the one that comes to mind. The Philippines, in general, is probably the most accomplished leader in terms of gender in the Asia Pacific region, and that is because they have a policy that's the gender and development policy, and then they also have the Magna Carta for women policy.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, they require every single federal budget to allocate 5% of their budget for women and development in
Okay.
every department of the government, which I've never seen in any other country. Now, they are struggling a bit with actually implementing that policy, but
Mm-hmm.
it is at least one of the most progressive policies I've ever seen in terms
Right.
of resourcing this
Mm-hmm.
work. And as a result, they've made actually quite a bit of progress, and they have some really progressive and thoughtful policies that are trying to attack these in like the nexus of gender, climate, and security.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that is really exciting. I think that sometimes we forget that, um, and in your talk, this emerged a lot, right? That there are norms around these issues, especially culture norms, gender norms, and that part of what the difficult part is sort of shaping and reshaping those norms, right? And part of doing that is putting the policies into place proactively, even if you can't fully fund it, right? But that becomes a part of the thinking.
Yeah.
I Do you have any other kinds of concrete suggestions, from your research or your observations on the ground for um, sort of reshaping norms, right? Those closely held norms. Have you observed those things sort of shifting on the ground?
You know, what I can think of is the opposite. That's what comes to mind. Uh, there's so in Papua New Guinea, they have this problem of sorcery-based crimes. And because of stresses like climate change, as resources have become more constrained, communities come into tension with each other, there's competition over resources. And this is very common. Gender norms tend to become often more conservative during times of stress.
Okay.
And so, as a result, there's been this rise in essentially what is similar to the Salem witch trials, in that women are being accused unjustly of sorcery crimes in order to take those women out of those communities and then free up resources for other communities that are in competition for them. So, that's a negative example. I'm trying to think of a positive example where there has been some shifts.
Well, I was being
Um,
optimistic. I mean,
yeah,
I was, you know, sort of being up and just in case there was something, and with the understanding that, that those kind of norms do often become just intensified during disasters. Um, so I wanted to, I have another question. Okay, so thinking about women, and I know that your approach to research is, you know, really grounded in feminist principles and sort of thinking not just about women, but thinking about intersectionality. And so I wanted to ask about other marginalized groups, right, and how they've been uniquely impacted by climate induced disasters. And, you know, are you aware of any movement, either civil, military, or otherwise, about trying to address other marginalized groups, whether that's disability or something else?
yeah. Um, I will say that I think the strengths of the feminist movement is its self-critical nature, which can be a little bit brutal at times, but also really constructive in that through this self-critical process that feminist theory goes through in every new iteration, they examine ways in which their own biases and privilege can impact their research and impact outcomes. And through the process, the feminist thinkers, I think, widen the scope of who is vulnerable and who has no power and who does have power, and then through that they have sort of grown the tent of feminist justice to include people with disabilities and indigenous groups and
Mm-hmm.
other vulnerable communities. So um, I would say people with disabilities is a significant point of concern for women's groups in general these days, because women tend to be the ones taking care of people with disabilities in their own families. And so people with disabilities have become a central part of the women, peace, and security agenda in terms of responding to humanitarian crises.
Mm-hmm.
And so there has been a growing attention paid to people with disabilities, especially in disaster situations. And when I think about Indigenous peoples, what is often happening is that as, say, sea level rise increases, there can be a restriction in terms of traditional land because it gets smaller and smaller. And so that can increase tensions between Indigenous people groups. And so that's another significant challenge as communities consider whether they are going to remain or stay. There's also the issue of women's voices and whether their needs are being taken into consideration in those decisions, but then also how to maintain cultural integrity of those communities regardless of whether they remain or stay. And so that has been a growing, resounding call for more thinking and research to happen in that area. And this is most common in the Pacific Island communities, but it's not uncommon in places like Papua New Guinea as well.
Okay, okay, okay. I have a question from the audience here about how to involve more women in government and international relations with regards to climate security issues, right? Wait, excuse me, I guess thinking about concrete ways we might actually go about, you know, doing that so that we can take seriously that participation role of the WPS agenda.
Yeah, there are a variety of different spheres in which climate security discussions take place. There's the COP level discussions that are negotiating um, plans for countries to reduce their emissions, as well as climate financing. And in those spheres, women still tend to be a minuscule percentage of the actual negotiators. I
Mhm.
think it's I think it's under 5% that are
Mhm.
actually women in the room in the
Mhm.
most important discussions. And so, yes, definitely opportunity for women to take more leadership roles in those spaces. Um, in globally, I did an analysis of women's involvement in parliaments, and still, on average, countries have less than 10% women in parliament, especially in the upper houses that have more power. And so certainly there's plenty of room for women to take more leadership roles in those spaces as well. And it's at those levels that countries are making their decisions about how to reduce their climate emissions and how the country as a whole will address both adaptation and response. And
Mhm.
so we need women in leadership in all of those spaces. At community levels, I think that might be where we see more actual progress. And that really is very context specific. One of the most important principles of feminist theory is that we must look at the very specific context that we are studying, because especially when it comes to gender, because each community will manifest gender norms in a different way, and they intersect with other cultural norms in very complex ways. And so we need to look at those things individually and assess what is happening in each of those communities. But because of that great variety in how gender norms are expressed, there are some communities that are making real progress in having women
Mhm.
in leadership. And this is sometimes taking place in communities where there's been a lot of male out migration, and women are now having more and more opportunities than ever to take on leadership roles, which is an unfortunate but understandable result of some of the climate pressures and how they're changing communities. So, in some cases, the opposite is happening. But
Mhm.
I think there's some opportunity, like we can see opportunity in that area. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think there's reason to be optimistic if we see these changes as opportunities to transform gender norms.
Okay. Okay. I mean, thinking about that, I mean, this is a little bit more just kind of a follow up, something that has just occurred to me. Thinking about how you actually do the research on the ground, because you have mentioned, feminist praxis. Then it's so I'm kind of curious about how you design and implement, the some of the research that you've done on the ground that informs this talk. I mean, perhaps just an example or.
Yeah, there are a couple. One of the a practice that is used very commonly in feminist research is co-creation of research design. And I think that's an important element that allows us to take the context of the community into consideration, find out what it is that are, the actual important questions to ask by
Mhm.
talking to people, especially women, to find out where things are at right now, and then asking them what would be the most important insights for them
Mhm.
to discover through the research that you're doing. So that's something that we've been emphasizing, is trying to bring in the women's groups from the very start in terms of designing our research, and learning from them so that we deliver research and work together with them to implement research that has impact in the communities. The other aspect I think that's really important is not to be extractive,
Mhm.
which is how a lot of traditional research is done.
Mhm.
And that is that researchers will go in, they will take people's time, often without any compensation. So they're having to volunteer their time to answer questions or surveys or be in focus groups. And then not only is the research not taken back to the community, so they don't hear what the outcomes are, but there's no real benefit to those communities to having gone
Mhm.
through that research process. And so another really important principle within feminist research is to do capacity building as part of the research process itself. And
Mhm.
so you're not only building skills into the community to be able to do this research themselves, but then they become participants in the actual research outcomes. And owners, in part owners in many ways of the research, and then they have access to it, the results in the end, and they can hopefully through that capacity building know how to use that in advocacy with their own governments and
Mhm.
community leadership.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. That was one thing that I noticed with research on the ground, especially post the 3/11 disaster in
Mm.
the northern part of Japan, and going in and talking to women who suddenly found themselves in these leadership positions, but they did not understand um, for themselves that they actually had a particular kind of expertise
Mm.
that was very useful, both in terms of like the immediate response, but also in terms of sort of reconstructing their communities, and therefore and building resilience into
Mm.
that reconstruction, right? And so just I found that just the way that we think about it, and thinking about um, folks as having expertise, it's not just they have this lived experience, but if we sort of reframe um, what they offer and what they're bringing, in terms that make us sort of recognize the value in a different way, and then talk to them about it using that language. I mean, of course, a lot of times people are too shy and they don't think that they're at all experts, but I do think that sort of makes a real difference, right? Both in terms of how we respond to the folks that we talk with in the field, but also in terms of how that impacts their future leadership potential in their own community, right?
Yeah.
It was kind of just an aside. We have, I think, time probably for one more question, and so I have a couple, but why don't I just end with asking you to share some of the feminist solutions that your firm, aXXelerate, has worked on to address climate security and its gendered impacts. And then also how these have been received by the organizations that you've worked with, like the U.S. Department of Defense or the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah. Um, we so the probably the most clear example of that is the climate security, women, peace, and security project that we implemented on behalf of the Department of Defense. And we did that in 7 different Indo-Pacific countries. So we covered Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. And we basically took them through a process for them to think through 15 different indicators that
Mm-hmm.
were developed by the Hague Center for Security Studies
Mm-hmm.
on climate insecurities, and then applied a gender lens to those things and helped them identify which of those indicators were the most salient for their own particular contexts,
Mm-hmm.
and then develop some questions that they could take back to their governments that got to the things that they like, the areas where they felt their governments needed to do more work in order to support women in post-disaster situations. It was really only the start of that. A lot more work needs to be done. Um, in Japan, they have developed this emergency shelter checklist for gendered considerations, which is actually a really interesting tool that makes it very practical and very tangible in terms of how to apply a gender lens in a disaster situation. And
Mm-hmm.
what I would like to see in the future is to have trainings for community women's groups, for them to develop each their own checklists that apply not just to emergency shelters, but also to early warning systems and healthcare facilities and a variety of other things. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a start, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. We're right at time. This has been a really informative talk and a nice conversation as well. But we'll end it there, even though we have a couple of more questions. And I thank you so much for sharing your work with us today.
well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for listening. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm sure Dr. Flowers can pass along my contact information.
Excellent. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.